The classic unsolved American crime.
This is the Zodiac speaking.
It's America's most famous cold case.
In August 1969, 3 newspapers in the United States received mystery-coded letters marked with a symbol, a circle with a plus sign over it. The author of the chilling letters claimed responsibility for 3 unsolved deaths in the previous 6 months, providing details about the murder cases that only the true killer could have known. The police were able to decrypt one of the coded letters, and one thing became very evident: the killer was going to kill again. The Zodiac Killer case has been considered the most famous unsolved murder case in American history, so I believe it is fascinating to investigate. So stay tuned as we dive into this horrifying and terrible crime committed by this frightening serial killer. Welcome back to Yarrow Crime, where we go down the rabbit hole to bring you crime stories and theories from across the world. When the Vallejo Times-Herald, the San Francisco Chronicle, and the San Francisco Examiner received the initial letters, 4 young people had been savagely attacked, and 3 of them had been slain in the San Francisco Bay region on December 20th, 1968. After spending some time with friends, 17-year-old David Arthur Faraday and 16-year-old Betty Lou Jensen drove out to Lake Herman Road, also known as Lover's Lane, for their first official date. David had assured Betty's parents that he would bring her back home by 11 p.m., but that time came and went without signs of the couple. Minutes later, at about 11:15 p.m., a woman named Stella Borges was driving home near Lake Harbin Road. When she noticed 2 people lying on the side of the road, Stella managed to flag down a patrol car approaching the scene, and the officers discovered the bodies of David and Betty. Both teenagers had been shot with a .22 caliber pistol, with David in the head and Betty 5 times in the back. The investigators had very little to work with while trying to figure out what had happened. The couple was believed to have been targeted by a total stranger who happened to be in the neighborhood at the same time as David and Betty. An opportunistic killing. Aside from that, there were no clues or evidence for authorities to follow, and they could only hope that this was the killer's only strike. But only a half-year later, another couple was attacked. 22-year-old Darlene Farron and her 19-year-old friend Michael Mike Michelle were driving around on July 4th, 1969, when they came to a stop at Blue Rock Springs Park in Vallejo. Soon after, a light-colored car came into the parking lot, the identical vehicle that had been following them earlier. Surprisingly, the car merely paused for a second close to Darlene and Mike before driving away. However, while the couple may have felt they had successfully gotten rid of the mysterious stranger, the identical car returned 10 minutes later, partially behind the couple's vehicle. This time, the driver exited the vehicle holding a flashlight. He came up to the passenger side window of Darlene's bronze Corvair and dazzled the pair with a bright light. Before firing his 9mm handgun multiple times, bullets ripped through Mike's mouth and tongue, while others injured him in the arm, leg, and neck, while bullets punctured Darlene's lungs and heart. 2 minutes later, the Vallejo Police Department received a terrifying call. The killer had contacted the police to report the crime, but he also told them he was the one who murdered David and Betty. This was the killer's first contact with the police, but it would not be his last. Almost a month after the Blue Rock Springs Park shooting, the killers boldly claimed credit in letters to California newspapers. While the killer baited the cops, they promised they would discover his identity once they cracked his code. He also gave himself a name, which would become one of the most infamous monikers in history. On August 7, 1969, the killer began his letter by writing, "Dear Editor, this is the Zodiac speaking, the Zodiac Killer." One would expect that such a talkative killer would eventually make a mistake and expose something that would help the police catch him. Despite the Zodiac's communication, the cops were no closer to apprehending him. On September 27, 1969, Cecilia Ann Shepard, 22, and Brian Hartnell, 20, were attacked while having a picnic at Lake Berryessa. A man with a black executioner's hood approached the couple. The masked man tied them up before repeatedly stabbing Cecilia and Brian with a 12-inch knife. Brian and Cecilia were seriously injured, but they managed to draw attention of a fisherman and his son, who called for assistance by contacting park rangers. Despite her severe injuries, Cecilia was able to provide the Napa County Sheriff's deputies with a description of the perpetrator. However, at the hospital, she fell into a coma and died 2 days later, while Brian ultimately recovered from his injuries. The Zodiac Killer called the cops again, this time claiming a double murder, despite the fact that one of his victims had survived. Only a few weeks later, on October 11, 1969, 29-year-old taxi driver Paul Lee Stine provided a ride to an unknown customer in San Francisco when he was shot once in the head with a 9mm handgun. The killer casually strolled away from the scene after grabbing Paul's wallet, car keys, and a piece of his blood-stained clothing. The killer was still in the neighborhood when the police were alerted, and a patrol unit hurried to the taxi park on Cherry Street. Officers Don Falk and Eric Helms approached him at 10 p.m. and asked him if he had seen anything suspicious. He told the officers that he had seen a man running east on Washington with a gun, and while the patrol car sped away in that direction, the Zodiac Killer continued on his way. Because the initial report received by the police stated that they were looking for a black man rather than a white man, that one mistake denied the authorities their one chance to apprehend the Zodiac Killer. A composite sketch of the Zodiac Killer was made from descriptions of the killer provided by 3 teens who had witnessed the most recent murder and by 2 police officers who had recently spoken with the killer. The police continue their investigation, making little headway over the years. Over 2,500 people were investigated and interviewed, but only one was publicly identified as a suspect: Arthur Lee Allen. According to individuals who knew him, Arthur was a school teacher who lived in Vallejo at the time of the murders and had a habit of driving alone in remote places. Arthur frequently discussed troubling topics, such as his desire to murder people and his usage of the name Zodiac. Eventually, the cops had enough evidence to secure search warrants. The authorities searched Arthur's residence twice, and the second time they recovered a 12-inch knife, extremely identical to the one used in the last various attacks. Frank Michaud, one of the survivors, identified Arthur's face in a photo lineup and said, "That's him. That's the individual who shot me." Nonetheless, the authorities were never able to charge Arthur Allen with the Zodiac murders. They were unable to gather sufficient evidence, and Arthur died of a heart attack on August 26, 1992, taking all possible answers with him to his grave. Furthermore, DNA tests performed in 2002 seemed to exclude Arthur as a suspect, as his staples did not match those obtained from the Zodiac letters, stamps, and envelopes. Since then, several other people have been suspected of being the Zodiac Killer, but none of the theories have been substantiated. So, officially, the case of the Zodiac Killer still remains open and unsolved. Who do you think is the Zodiac Killer? Let us know in the comments, and as always, do not forget to like the video and subscribe to Yarrow Crime for more true crime videos.